Hola. So, over the last few years, it feels like almost every day I've been asking myself this same question. What on earth is going on? You might see, for example, someone driving alone in their car with a face mask on, which makes absolutely no rational, logical sense, obviously. I have a friend, he's probably the smartest person I've ever met, maybe even. And I met him for dinner under lockdown, and we went into the restaurant. As per the rules, he was wearing a face mask to walk to the table, and then would sit down at the table and take the mask off. And if he wanted to go to the bathroom, he'd have to put the mask back on to stand up to go to the bathroom, come back, sit down, take it off, which is, with all due respect, insane. It doesn't make any logical, rational sense. So a lot of us have been, a lot of people have been very irrational and biased. There's been a lot of irrationality over the last 2 years. It's proof that we're all irrational if it were needed. But we all are. We all have these irrationalities and biases. We don't have the brain power, as I'll explain, to go through life making careful, logical, rational choices. We just don't have the time or energy. But the case I'm going to make here is that these shortcuts, these biases that we all have been exploited and used to control our behavior. So Edward Bernays was a pioneer of advertising and marketing and public relations. He literally wrote the book on propaganda. He wrote this book called Propaganda, quite an influential, famous book. And he actually, interestingly, was the great-grand uncle of Mark Bernays Randolph, who is the CEO and co-founder of Netflix. So make of that what you will. Bernays himself was related to Freud. He got women to smoke cigarettes by saying it was liberating, that kind of thing. He was a real kind of marketing genius of sorts. And what he said in his book was the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power. So he's saying that obviously there are these kind of puppet masters who know how to pull our strings. They're not necessarily people who are elected. They're not necessarily the government, but they are potentially an invisible government who really hold the power. So maybe I'm naive, but I always had this kind of understanding that we lived in a democracy where you would vote for politicians and politicians would do what most people voted for. So there was this kind of understanding that politicians would, through voting, enact the will of the people. But what I suppose Bernays was suggesting, and what we're seeing quite explicitly, is what you could call a nudgeocracy, where it's kind of the opposite, where politicians change the will of the people. They're using these behavioral science techniques. They decide what we should think and feel and do, and they're using these techniques to change our will, to change what we want to do. There's also a principle in psychology called the attitude-behavior gap, which refers to the fact that often what we say and what we actually do don't quite align. For example, if you ask people, should you do the unpleasant stuff now and put off the enjoyable stuff to the future, almost everyone will say you should do the unpleasant stuff now. But if you give people some unpleasant stuff to do, the vast majority will put it off to the future. So this is quite a known principle in behavioral science, but it seems to have kind of developed a bit recently. The attitude-behavior gap now seems to be more about behavioral scientists' attitudes and your behavior, or our behavior, the gap between the two, and how they are introducing these interventions to make us behave more in line with their attitudes, what they think we should be doing, getting vaccines, stopping driving, eating insects, whatever it might be. And I think eating insects is a really, really interesting example here, just to go off-piste a little bit. So there's a lot, I don't know what it's like here, but in the UK it's kind of relentless messaging in TV programs and in the news and from celebrities that we have to eat insects. So for example, Aldi, the supermarket, is going to start selling insect ready meals, which were on a TV show. We also have the Great British Bake Off, where a contestant baked insects into a cake, and the presenter said how everyone will be doing this in the future, how it's great. There is primary schools in Wales starting to feed insects to children. because children are more open to things, so they're less likely to resist it. And the messaging around eating insects has behavioral scientists' fingerprints all over it. For example, they'll often say 2 billion people worldwide already eat insects. First of all, that's nonsense. There's an academic paper showing that's not true. It's vastly overstated. But anyway, the flip side of this is that 6 billion people, 75%, do not eat insects. But they're not saying 25%, they're saying 2 billion because it sounds larger. They're trying to use social proof. Lots of celebrities have been shown eating insects, like Nicole Kidman and Robert Downey Jr., and that is using kind of messenger effects because we trust and tend to follow celebrities. And also the language that they use. So, for example, they use crickets and mealworms because they sound friendlier and nicer. They're not, for example, dangerous. Cricket sounds like chicken. Mealworms has the word meal in it. So they're using these kind of friendlier words rather than telling us to eat spiders and wasps, which we'd have a much stronger reaction to. But the interesting thing here is that nobody wants to eat insects, really. It's disgusting. We're kind of hardwired not to do it. But these behavioral scientists think they know better, and they want to reach inside our heads and fiddle with the wiring and change this innate hardwired disgust that we have. It's this top-down mandate. They don't care what we want. They have a certain agenda, and they're going to nudge us until we meet it. So bringing this back to COVID, this was very explicit from the UK government. The SAGE, the Scientific Advisories Group for Emergencies, I think, they released a document, their behavioral science team did, which famously said, a substantial number of people still do not feel sufficiently personally threatened. The perceived level of personal threat needs to be increased among those who are complacent using hard-hitting emotional messaging. So again, they wanted people to be scared. They didn't care if people were scared or not. They had a goal in mind that people must and should be scared, and so they used behavioral science to make that happen. For example, in the UK, there was quite a famous advertising campaign from the government. You can see here, look him in the eyes and tell him you always keep a safe distance. You always keep a safe distance. And this, again, has behavioral scientists' fingerprints all over it. Mostly because it uses both fear and efficacy. So this is where you load people up with negative emotion to motivate them, but you make sure an action is easy. You give them an easy kind of route to express, to vent that emotion. So they're filling people with fear and then saying, okay, if you feel scared, you must keep a safe distance. They're also using something called the watching eyes effect, where if you feel like you're being watched, you're more likely to act pro-socially. Studies have found if you have a picture of eyes, people are more likely to wash their hands, to put money in a charity box, all sorts of things. They're using the identifiable victim effect, where the death of one is a tragedy, or the death of millions is just a statistic. So they're giving you a picture of a person, his kind of story, his name. Of course, they're using fear and efficacy, as I said. They're using messenger effects by having it come from the NHS, who people at least used to like and trust, so they're more likely to accept the message. And they're also using accountability by saying you personally, specifically, must do this. You can't diffuse responsibility to the group. So lots of nudges packed in here. Yeah, okay. And another example is the numbers that they used, really, in line with that quote, to inflate the feeling of fear among the public. So, for example, in the UK, and I'm sure everywhere else, they would report in the news and from the government the number of new cases every day. So it's spiking into the tens or hundreds of thousands. It looks very scary. But there's a technique in psychology called framing, where if you present something a certain way, people might see it as a loss and think it's scary. If you present it in another way, it can be seen in a more positive light. So what they could have done, if they didn't want to scare people and panic people, is maybe show the percentage of tests that were negative and fully shown the y-axis from 0 to 100. Suddenly it's a lot less frightening, right? But they did this deliberately, and you can tell because they presented the cases and deaths as an absolute number every day, whereas with vaccines they presented it cumulatively because they wanted to use social proof, the bandwagon effect. So it looks like, oh, all of these people are getting vaccinated, I should too. But here they wanted to make it look as scary as possible. And we have somewhat of an admission of this kind of reframing, representing of statistics from Australia, New South Wales. There was, I think, a leaked or an information request, a leak or an information request, which found that the government deliberately massaged the presentation of the risk of vaccine side effects to make it more palatable to people. So instead of saying there's a 1 in a million chance of a side effect, they were advised to say there's a 0.000 whatever 1% chance of a side effect, because 1 in a million people imagine themselves as the one. It's the same reason why people play the lottery. You don't think about astronomical odds of winning, you just think of yourself as the one and all of the good stuff that comes with winning. So there's this admission that the statistics were massaged in this way to have a psychological effect. And the reason this all happens is because we are, all of us, what's known as cognitive misers. We have very limited brain power and time and motivation for paying attention to the world and making decisions. The world is, or the universe is infinitely big. There's an infinite amount of choice and information out there, and we can each see only really a tiny, tiny pinprick of it through a very biased, imperfect lens. So we can't process all of this information rationally. It has been estimated by one researcher, we make 200 food-related decisions each day, and that's just food. If we had to think through them all carefully, rationally, we'd never get anything done. It would take too much time and too much energy. And so because of that, we tend to rely on heuristics or shortcuts. These are rules of thumb that let us navigate the world on autopilot without having to think in too much detail. So let's say you're in a foreign country or foreign city, just for one night for a business trip, and you're looking for somewhere for dinner, and you can only find 2 restaurants. You can either eat at the one on the left or the one on the right. Just a quick show of hands, who would rather eat at the one on the left? So I think most hands going up there. Why? Because it's busy, it's popular, and so immediately, straight away, you know if it's busy, if all of these people think it's good, it therefore must be good. And this is an example of one of these shortcuts. It's called social proof, where if everyone else is doing something, it must be the right thing to do. Generally speaking, that's correct, and it's ensured our survival for a long time, but it can be exploited to make us do things that might not be in our best interests. And this is the field of nudging, essentially, where you take these kind of principles and you use them to influence behavior, particularly from a public policy perspective. So, for example, if you send out a letter telling people to fill in their tax returns, if you tell people everyone else in your neighborhood has filled in your tax return, they're more likely to because of social proof. And so the author of Nudge, the original book, he signed my book, and he signed it as he signs all books, Nudge for Good. And then under COVID, he recommended or said that COVID vaccine passports should be introduced, and you shouldn't be allowed to travel or go in a restaurant or all of these things unless you have a passport. So the road to hell is paved with good intentions is, I suppose, the point I'm trying to make here. I would argue there's probably nothing really bad with using nudging to get people to exercise more and to eat more fruit and vegetables. But I think when the government is all powerful and it has a very single-minded goal, that's when things can get a bit dangerous. And so to give you an example of nudging, nudging itself is an example of nudging. So there is a nudge called loss aversion, where we're about twice as sensitive to potential loss as we are to potential gains. And so if you present something as a loss, people are more averse to it. So for example, if you're selling beef, you'll sell more of it if you call it 80% lean rather than 20% fat, even though they mean the same thing. Or people are more likely to have a medical procedure if you say you have a 99% chance of survival rather than a 1% chance of dying. And so nudging is itself, I think, a nudge. They've taken what is subconscious manipulation and reframed it into nudging, which sounds very positive and gentle and nice, but that's really what it is. And so to give you an example, this was a text that was sent in the UK for the COVID vaccine. And in just 19 words, they've managed to fit 6 nudges quite powerfully, effectively here. So the text read, "You have reached the top of the queue and are a priority for getting a free NHS COVID-19 vaccine." So by saying there's a queue, they're using social proof. So it must be popular. Everyone's doing it, so you can trust it. It's good. By saying you've reached the top of the queue, they're using a nudge called commitment, where you feel invested, like you don't want to lose your place in the queue. By calling it the top of the queue, they're using ego to make you feel special, like you're above everyone below you. By calling you a priority, they're using scarcity to imply there's short supply, and therefore makes you feel urgency to go and get it. They're giving it for free using reciprocity, so you feel obligated to do them a favor in return. And by having it come from the NHS, they're using messenger effects, where the NHS is or was liked and trusted, and therefore people are more likely to accept a message that comes from the NHS. Another nudge that was used quite a lot more broadly was something called the foot in the door technique. This is a bit like the boiling frog metaphor, which I'm sure you've heard of, but if you want to boil a frog, for whatever reason, if you try and put it in boiling water, it would jump out, so the analogy goes, but if you put it in cold water and gradually turn the heat up, it will stay there and get cooked. And so how do you get people to comply with a 2-year lockdown? Well, you start out by saying, well, please stay at home voluntarily if you want to, you don't have to. And then you say, well, you do have to, but it's only for 3 weeks. And then you just keep going bit by bit by bit, gradually, the foot in the door technique. And in particular, there was a 3-step process that the British government used a lot, which I called deny, debate, demand. So they would originally deny that they were going to do some kind of policy, like vaccine passports. So in January 21, the health secretary said the government has no plans to introduce vaccine passports. And ministers 11 separate times explicitly said there were no plans to introduce vaccine passports. But what they're doing here is shifting the window of perception, and they're introducing the idea of vaccine passports into people's heads. So what used to be unthinkable has now become thinkable, at least. And the more you hear something, the more kind of familiar and comfortable you're going to get with it. At the same time, by denying they're going to do it, they're kind of putting your fears at rest. So they're introducing it to you in a kind of comfortable, non-threatening way. Once the groundwork has been laid like that, then they would debate, which is where they would kind of ramp up the dial and say, okay, well, maybe, we should at least think about it. Zahawi said it would be completely remiss and responsible not to at least consider, trialing vaccine passports. And then by December, they'd introduce vaccine passports. And so people often ask me, why can some people kind of see through this, and why are some people more resistant or awake, as often said, versus others? Well, on the side of people who seem to not really see what might be going on, there's a number of biases which might be at play. Essentially, to sum it up, people like to be liked and they like to be right. So they want to fit in and not be ostracized, and they also don't like to have their perception of the world be completely destroyed. So some of these biases, willful blindness is where your brain won't let you see things that could be traumatic. So it's a bit like the ostrich effect, where people just put their head in the sand and they won't look at something that could be psychologically painful. Similarly, cognitive dissonance. If something doesn't fit our expectations, if it's not what we expect, we'll come up with all sorts of rationalizations and excuses to try and understand it rather than just deal with it and process it, like denial, for example. System justification is where people who are raised in a system, in a particular country, for example, and believe in it and have benefited from it, they can't possibly countenance the idea that it could be bad or wrong in some way. Terror management, or fear of death, is where if we think about death, we hate doing that. We hate kind of facing our mortality. So we use all kind of psychological firewalls to stop us from doing that. Likewise, reality extinction, if your entire view of how the world works is threatened, you'll kind of close up and shy away from it. Conformity, as you will know, I'm sure we tend to follow the crowd. We tend to be quite tribal, and we'll reject information if it comes from the other side. As I said earlier, we are cognitive misers with very limited brain power and time, so we just don't have the time to read all these academic papers and read all the scientific evidence to come to a more informed conclusion. So we have to kind of trust authority and the crowd instead. Learned helplessness could be where people feel powerless, so they don't even bother trying to resist. Authority is, again, as cognitive misers, we have to trust people in authority because we can't think through everything ourselves. And then regression is the fact that really most people like to be submissive. Most people, everyone has to submit to something. And in this kind of more nihilistic age, people aren't religious, less of connection to a community, all of these kind of things. People are craving to be told what to do, essentially. There is also another interesting principle called disrupt then reframe, which is all about shaking people up so then that they're more likely to accept a new way of thinking. This is what classic brainwashing is all about. You see it in interrogations and in torture and in totalitarian regimes. It's about confusing people, overwhelming them with emotion, and just really disabling their ability to think critically. For example, in Guantanamo Bay, they might play rock music really loudly all hours of the day and not let you sleep, and then blindfold you and make you stand in a stressful position for hours. Even the song Baby Shark has been used as torture. And this basically disintegrates your critical thinking so that new ways of thinking can be implanted. And this is an interesting point because we seem to be at a point in history which may be repeated every generation, every 80 to 100 years. There are a lot of parallels with how society is now compared to how it was 80 to 100 years ago in mainland Europe. We're going through an industrial revolution. There's no trust in politicians or the press. We've just had a pandemic. There is kind of moral decay. You know, anything goes really these days. We have hyperinflation, cost of living crisis, and we have new means of communication. But what this does is, again, it's like a disintegration of the structures that usually bind us. You know, everything's fluid now. There's this fluidity. And what this means is that people are more emotional and more reactive, and therefore more open to being remolded, to being nudged and manipulated. There's an esoteric principle called dissolve and coagulate. So essentially, you break things down, and then they can be rebuilt. And then this is to say nothing of where we're heading technologically, socially. Vaccine passports, which I know it's kind of died down a bit, but bear in mind that income tax was first introduced as a temporary measure, and then it went away, and then it came back, and then it went away, and then it came back. So you're probably going to see the same thing with these digital IDs. But the real danger is that they make the state omniscient because it collects all your data and attaches it to a digital central identity, and predictive algorithms can tell all sorts of things about you. So if this digital ID is connected to what you buy, your financial transactions, they can already, I work in this field, I can tell you they can already predict your mental health, your personality, your life satisfaction, your sexuality and drug use. All sorts of things can be predicted. So they'll know everything personal about you. And then if you have to have this to get into restaurants and to buy food, that then makes the state omnipotent. So they're all powerful. They can make you do whatever they want. So it's quite a scary way that we're moving to. And then so on the other side is what makes us or makes certain people different. I think there's three things. One is intuition, so listening to your gut. As Orwell said, some things are so absurd only an intellectual could believe them. You know, intellect is great, but it also allows you to kind of build castles in the sky, as it were, that are not really connected to reality and to practical, the practical world. Experience or kind of immunity. If you've had certain experiences that don't make you trust the press, say, or authority, people who've been through some trauma or abuse, they tend to be a bit more immune to these techniques when they're used on a wider scale. And finally, there are some personality traits. So if you're lower on agreeableness, like me, you're less likely to cooperate, to trust, to agree with things, basically. So you have a lower need to belong. You don't really care if the crowd accepts you or not. An interesting point here to make is that healthcare practitioners, present company excluded, tend to be more likely to follow norms and follow authority because they tend to be more conscientious, so more organized, hardworking, you have to be to get through medical school. And also they tend to be more agreeable, so more caring and empathetic and cooperative, which, someone who goes into a caring industry probably has that trait, which normally is a great thing, but it does make healthcare practitioners more likely to comply. So I like to bear this guy in mind. He is very disagreeable. He is not agreeing or cooperating at all. People will tell you it's a bad thing to be disagreeable, that you're psychopathic or whatever. Sometimes it's good to be what Socrates called a gadfly and just be a bit annoying, a bit cynical. and a bit of a stick in the mud. So finally, what to do about nudges and how to not be nudged. I think there's 3 general principles. One is what I call uncover. So you're less likely, somewhat less likely to be influenced by these techniques if you know what they are and if you can spot them. So read all the materials you can about this and immunize yourself. Second is unplug, which is just basically about step away. There's a saying that if you hang around in a barber's long enough, sooner or later you'll get your hair cut. And so even if you are watching the news critically, if you are consuming this information critically, it's still getting into your head and it still will influence you one way or another. And finally, just kind of uplift your level of consciousness to be a bit more rational, a bit less emotional. The more kind of emotional you are, as I say, the more reactive you are and the more manipulatable you are. So anything like meditation, exercise, it sounds cliched, but it's really, really good for maintaining a kind of higher level of consciousness, as it were. So a nice quote just to end on. This is in a great book called Battle of the Mind, which is an old school book about brainwashing. And he says, when Pavlov's dog suddenly refuses to pay any attention to the flashing lights and other signals intended for his conditioning, his brain remains unaffected. Human beings, like dogs, do not break down if they simply refuse to face the task or problem presented to them, or take evasive action before giving it a chance to upset their emotional equilibrium. So it's kind of about moving away, building parallel economies, these kind of things, and just not really engaging with this stuff anymore is really the most effective thing you can do. I interviewed a magician for a book I'm writing, and I asked him, how can people not get tricked by magicians? And his answer was, if you don't want to get tricked, don't go to the show. And that's it, really. Obrigado.